a legacy saved by a stranger. It began on a day that should have marked the quiet decline of a billionaire's empire. The numbers were falling. Confidence was fading. The once mighty organization stood on the edge of becoming a cautionary tale. And yet, in the midst of this slow unraveling, help didn't come from a trusted advisor, a loyal executive, or a longtime partner. It came from someone the billionaire had never met. People imagine that great legacies are preserved by powerful allies or brilliant insiders. But sometimes, the person who saves everything isn't part of the story until the very moment everything is about to break. And in a world where empires can collapse overnight, the idea that a stranger could rewrite destiny feels almost impossible until it happens. The reveal began during a routine review of the company's final viability report. The billionaire sat surrounded by spreadsheets projecting years of decline, a single division failing, a critical technology plateauing, a cultural stagnation no internal team could seem to reverse. The empire wasn't dying loudly. It was fading quietly, like a light dimming without flicker or flame. During this bleak meeting, a staff assistant mentioned an unsolicited letter that had arrived days earlier, a letter dismissed by most as noise, as irrelevant input from an outsider. But the assistant insisted it contained something unusual, a perspective no one inside the company had considered. Reluctantly, the billionaire opened it. The letter came from an unknown engineer, working halfway across the world. Not famous, not credentialed by elite institutions, not someone anyone would expect to influence a multi-billion-dollar empire. Yet the message was startlingly clear, sharp, and fearless. It pinpointed a flaw in the company's outdated approach. It outlined solutions so simple and elegant that it felt impossible the internal teams had overlooked it. More unsettling was the tone. The engineer didn't ask for a job, praise the billionaire, or beg to be noticed. They simply wrote because they saw something worth saving, and believed no one else would say it. The billionaire felt something shift. For the first time in months, a spark cut through the haze of decline. The stranger had seen the empire with clarity no insider possessed, and their idea, if true, could revive the very division dragging the company toward collapse. Cautiously, the billionaire began investigating. The deeper they looked, the more alarming and inspiring the truth became. The stranger wasn't guessing. They were right, and their insight would lead the billionaire down a path no one could have predicted. The investigation moved quickly, driven by a mixture of urgency and disbelief. The billionaire assembled a small confidential team to validate the stranger's claims. What they found was unsettling. The engineer's insight wasn't just accurate. It exposed a foundational flaw that had quietly undermined the company for years. A flaw internal teams had normalized, debated, or ignored depending on the politics of the moment. The reveal deepened when the team ran simulations using the stranger's proposed solution. Metrics shifted instantly. Inefficiencies evaporated. Growth curves reversed their decline. The division dragging the empire down suddenly appeared salvageable. Not through a massive overhaul, but through a shift so elegant it bordered on genius. The billionaire felt a shock of humility. How had thousands of employees, dozens of executives, and countless consultants missed what a single outsider saw so clearly? The question lingered like a quiet accusation, exposing the blind spot of a culture trapped in its own assumptions. Inside the company, subtle conflict began to surface. When word leaked that an unknown engineer had cracked a problem entire departments failed to solve, pride flared. Senior staff dismissed the findings as coincidence. Others argued the stranger lacked context, and the solution would collapse in real-world conditions. Some quietly feared exposure, afraid the revelation would reveal who had ignored early warning signs. Pressure mounted as the billionaire requested full-scale testing. Resources were redirected. Teams were reassigned. Executives accustomed to autonomy found themselves reporting daily on a plan they didn't originate. The internal resentment deepened. Whispers spread that the billionaire was desperate, searching for salvation in ideas that had never passed through proper channels. Then came the first major obstacle. A regulatory review committee rejected the initial proposal, not for safety, not for ethics, but because the structure of the fix required altering systems so deeply entrenched that approval would take months. The delay threatened to sink the empire before the solution could even launch. Investors panicked. Stock dipped. Opinion pieces declared the Billionaires' golden era officially over. The Billionaire felt the weight of failure tightening again. Hope that had flickered from the stranger's letter now dimmed beneath layers of procedure, skepticism, and bureaucratic resistance. But something deeper had shifted. The Billionaire knew the solution was real, and they refused to let it die in a stack of regulatory paperwork. Quietly, they reached out to the stranger. At first, the engineer didn't believe the request was genuine, but within hours, they were flown across continents and escorted into a private conference room where the Billionaire waited with a single question. "Tell me everything." The conversation lasted for hours. The stranger spoke with unfiltered clarity. No politics, no ego, no interest in titles or power, just insight, precision, vision. And in that conversation, the Billionaire realized something profound. The empire didn't need another executive. It needed truth unclouded by legacy. But bringing that truth into the company would ignite conflict on a scale no one was prepared for. The stakes were rising, and the next step would decide whether the empire could be saved or whether it would tear itself apart from the inside. The conflict erupted the moment the Billionaire introduced the stranger's solution to the senior leadership team. What should have been a breakthrough moment instead exposed the deepest fractures within the empire. Executives resisted openly now, no longer hiding their frustration behind polite language. Some questioned the stranger's credibility. Others attacked the data. A few implied, without saying directly, that the Billionaire was being reckless, grasping at unvetted ideas in a moment of desperation. The Billionaire watched the room with growing unease. These were the same leaders who had once celebrated innovation, who once prided themselves on agility and insight, yet now they clung to familiarity like armor, terrified that an outsider had succeeded where they had failed. Pride, not logic, had become the enemy. The tension sharpened when the stranger calmly addressed the objections. They explained the flaw, the fix, the projections. Their voice was steady, unthreatened, unburdened by corporate politics. But each word they spoke widened the divide. The executives, defensive and cornered, escalated the conflict. They argued certification timelines. They questioned the stranger's lack of institutional knowledge. They implied the solution was too disruptive. What they truly feared was exposure. Because if the stranger was right, then every decision they'd made for years had been wrong. The Billionaire felt the emotional weight mounting. They had expected resistance, but not this level of hostility, not this fear, not this willingness to sabotage a solution that could save the empire simply to protect egos. The stranger watched silently, sensing the tension, yet remained composed, as if the reaction only confirmed their understanding of why the empire was failing. Then came the breaking moment. A senior executive slammed a folder shut and declared the proposal dangerous, insisting that implementing it would destabilize the entire company. The Billionaire countered with data. The executive countered with hierarchy. The stranger countered with undeniable logic. Tension crackled through the room like electricity. Eventually, someone said the words everyone had been circling. "We cannot let an outsider dictate the future of this company." Silence fell. The Billionaire felt something within them snap, not in anger, but in clarity. The opposition wasn't about safety or strategy or timing. It was about identity. The empire had grown so insulated that it could no longer recognize brilliance unless it came from within its own walls. In the days that followed, the conflict deepened. Departments refused to cooperate. Executives stalled approvals. Middle managers quietly undermined pilot programs. Progress slowed to a crawl. And through it all, the stranger remained steadfast, working late alongside the Billionaire, refining models, adjusting parameters, preparing for the moment the empire would have no choice but to confront the truth. The emotional breaking point arrived during a late-night strategy session when the Billionaire reviewed the latest financial projections. The decline had accelerated. The empire no longer had years. It had months. The Billionaire looked at the stranger, someone who owed nothing to the company, who had no stake in its politics, who had traveled halfway across the world simply because they believed something worth saving was slipping away. And in that moment, the billionaire understood. If the empire was going to survive, the next step had to be drastic, audacious, entirely unlike anything the company had ever done. The decision that would follow would ignite the greatest internal upheaval in the history of the organization and determine whether a stranger could truly save a legacy. The climax arrived in a move so bold it stunned the entire empire. At dawn, the billionaire convened an emergency all-hands summit. Not in a boardroom, not in a filtered executive meeting, but in the company's largest auditorium. Thousands of employees filled the seats. Millions more watched through internal live streams. Unscripted, unedited, uncontrolled. The billionaire stepped onto the stage with a stranger at their side. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Senior executives shifted uneasily. For years, they had shaped the narrative, managed a flow of information, guarded the gates of decision-making. But today, those gates were thrown open. The billionaire began with truth, not the polished version, not the strategic version, the real version. They acknowledged the empire's decline, the structural flaws, the years of quiet stagnation masked by public success. They spoke of the unsolicited letter, the insight the stranger had offered, and the clarity it revealed. Every word cut through the tension like a blade. And yet with each sentence, the atmosphere shifted from shock to undeniable recognition. Then came the turning point. The stranger stepped forward, presenting the solution publicly, directly to the engineers, analysts, developers, and creators who actually built the empire. They broke down the flaw with precision. They explained the fix with elegance. They showed data so compelling that murmurs spread through the audience, not of disbelief but of realization. For the first time, the company saw what pride and hierarchy had hidden. The stranger wasn't a threat. They were the missing piece. The executives reacted with fury. Several stood, ready to object, to reclaim control of the narrative. But the billionaire spoke before they could take a step. From this moment forward, implementation authority shifts to an open collaborative task force, led by the people who understand the challenge, not the people who fear accountability. A shockwave rolled across the room. The billionaire continued, announcing a sweeping reorganization that bypassed old structures entirely. Committees dissolved. Departments merged. New innovation groups formed around the stranger's insight, empowered with direct access to resources once hoarded by senior leadership. And above all, a new cultural mandate emerged. Truth over hierarchy. Solutions over pride. Progress over ego. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in something far more powerful. Hope, because the employees knew what the executives refused to admit. The empire wasn't dying because it lacked talent. It was dying because it had stopped listening. The resolution unfolded in the months that followed. The stranger's solution was implemented piece by piece. Metrics improved faster than even the billionaire expected. The failing division stabilized, then grew. Investors returned. Analysts reversed their projections. And slowly, the empire reclaimed the momentum it had lost. As for the stranger, they rejected every job title the billionaire offered. They didn't want fame. They didn't want power. They didn't want ownership. They wanted the idea to live. And when their work was complete, they returned home, quietly, anonymously, leaving behind an empire transformed. The billionaires stood in the rebuilt heart of their company, realizing something profound. Some legacies are saved not by the people who built them, but by the people brave enough to speak when no one else will. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future.